Here at Hopewell Heights, we do a little bit of homemaking, a little bit of homesteading, lots of home cooking, and here and there, we solve some world problems. And today we're going to combine all of that for the ultimate conspiracy that involves baking homemade bread and feminism. You're going to want to stay tuned to hear why, baking your own bread might actually be putting you at risk for contracting feminism. I am really, really excited to talk about the topic of today's video because it's something that affects everyone. We are such a, carb-loving, carb-loading country, and so this is really important information. But before we get started, I just wanted to do a little personal update. This past weekend, John and I flew out to California with our two littlest kids. So we have 5 kids, and the 2 youngest are almost 3 and almost 8 months old. And we've traveled, I don't want to say a lot, but at least once a year, we take a big trip with all of our kids, and they usually do great. But you know what? We broke our streak. This was truly, I was kind of laughing about it, telling my mom, look up relaxing in a thesaurus, and the antonym would just be a description of this trip. It was so bad that by the end of it, all John and I could do was just laugh. Because the babies, they just weren't having it. The flights were really long, flying from the Midwest out to California. We had a connecting flight, layovers, and it was just a lot for them. In the past, anytime that we have flown with little guys, I always bring my wonderful wagon, and it's so great because, I would just put all of our luggage in there, our carry-on stuff, and put the babies in there, put car seats in there, and we wheel that thing straight up to the gate, and they take it from there and stow it for us, and we're good to go. But unbeknownst to me, they do not allow you to bring wonderful wagons up to the gate, or big wagons, I suppose, straight to the gate anymore. You actually have to check them. You can still bring strollers on flights, but you can't bring wagons. And we didn't know that. So we get to our first gate with the big wonderful wagon, and they're like, well, you can't bring this on the flight, and you have to board right now. We're like, well, what are we gonna do? So they were nice enough to stow it for us that one time. But that's just a little helpful piece of information if you do fly with kids and you have a big wagon and that's your plan. That cannot be your plan. You have to check the wagon. You have to pay to check it. But you can bring a stroller. So live and learn. Next time, we'll just have to bring a stroller when we fly somewhere with the little babies. So that was one thing. We ended up, not accounting for that, so we had to check more bags than we planned on. It was either that or carry them all through the airport with 2 babies that were the little guy started teething, and the toddler just wasn't having it. So yeah, it just wasn't the most relaxing time. Live and learn. I think one of the funnier moments, we drove out to Malibu and we were on the beach. And just absolutely breathtaking, just gorgeous. And we're there for a couple minutes, and the toddler just starts crying and says, I want to go home. I want to go to grandma's house. We bring you to Malibu Beach, and you want to go to grandma's house. It was actually really precious and made me feel really good that they love our home so much and that they love going to grandma's house so much. So it was really, really sweet. But anyway, we're home, we're unpacked, and I'm so glad to be home. So glad to be getting back to my favorite things, which is being here, taking care of our home. All right, let's get rolling. We've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time if we're going to get to the bottom of this case on today's homemaking conspiracy files. We're going to call this the case of homemade bread induced feminism. All right, so before I go into this, I'm going to need to review the anatomy of grains. We know that that's where wheat comes from. We use wheat flour to make bread. But there are all different types of grains, not just wheat. A grain is the term given to any member of the grass family that yields edible seeds. So a grain is actually the seed portion. That's what you're eating. So things such as corn, oats, rice, wheat, and barley. Today we're specifically talking about wheat, but these are all grains. And while we chat, I am making homemade sourdough biscuits with freshly milled flour from, I think I was using soft white wheat. So this recipe is on my blog. I will link it for you guys. It's just like I think it's called like brown butter cast iron biscuits or something like that. And we're just going to cook and chat. So let's go over what whole grain is, because you've probably seen things in the store labeled whole wheat or whole grain, but that is deceptive, and we'll get to that in a minute. One of my goals with homeschooling my kids is just to instill a love of learning in them, to equip them to be lifelong learners. You know, I did go to college, but a lot of the knowledge and education that I use in my day-to-day comes from things that I have taught since I graduated college. I just continue to build on my knowledge base, and that is actually, in my opinion, one of the blessings of being a homemaker, is that I do get to stay home. I do have free time where I get to read and explore topics that I find interesting. And when it comes to learning, visual learning is so important. About 80% of what we learn and take in and hold long term is visual. I use visual learning tools in my homeschool all the time, and that is one reason I love Kittl. Kittl is a graphic design platform where you can create beautiful visuals for your homeschool classroom, for your business. You can even create like t-shirts and different templates for a merch store, and I use it for all of those things. We're gonna learn the rosary in Latin. I'm gonna teach my kids the rosary in Latin, so I'm gonna make some little Latin rosary cards, but I also use Kittl to create graphics for my business, whether it's posts for Instagram, thumbnails for YouTube videos. Investing in a good quality printer and utilizing an easy to use graphic design platform like Kittl really does save in the long term, especially with homeschooling. I'm homeschooling 3 different grades, and I've got little kids like coming up through the years. So it's so much easier for me to just hop on Kittl and make whatever I need as far as a visual learning tool for my homeschool students. And then I print it, I laminate it, and I have it. It goes in our files and it stays with me for all of my homeschooling years, rather than having to try to find exactly what I need and then order it online. When you use my code HOPEWELLYT, you will get 25% off your first month or year of any paid Kittl plan. So I know you're gonna love Kittl. If you've been wanting to create your own designs for your business or your homeschool or for whatever, now is a great time to give them a try. I'll put more details in the description below the video. So notice the picture up in the corner of a whole grain. Let's briefly cover the anatomy. So there are 4 parts to a whole grain: the chaff or hull, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. So the chaff or the hull is the outermost, like papery thin part. That part is completely devoid of nutrition. It's inedible. So that might explain some things, you know, as far as biblical parables when Jesus talks about a threshing and winnowing, and, you know, chaff burning up, because it's useless. So the next part is the bran. That is the outer, like hard, outermost layer of the seed that protects it. The bran is really rich in B vitamins, iron, and other trace minerals, as well as soluble and insoluble fiber. It's also a really good source of protein and has enzymes that are essential for digestion of the grain. Now, the next part is the germ. The germ is the life of the grain. So think of a whole grain like an egg. We all have chickens, right? And we know that farm fresh eggs, there are 4 parts. There's that bloom, that, you know, protective layer on the outside of the egg. Then there's the shell, there's the egg white, and there's the yolk. So in a whole grain, the chaff or the hull is like the bloom. It's just that like really thin outer protective part that you can kind of, you know, wash away or remove away. And then the bran of the grain would be like an eggshell. The germ would be like the egg yolk. And so the germ of a grain is the most nutrient dense portion. It has fatty acids, and it's also one of the most abundant food sources of vitamin E. Then we get to the endosperm of the grain. This is like your egg white, right? And we all know when it comes to eggs, like your egg white and your yolk, they both have nutritional components, but the yolk is really the powerhouse nutritionally. And it's the same with the grain. The germ is the powerhouse. The endosperm, however, makes up most of the volume of the grain. It makes up 80 to 85% of the volume. This endosperm part of the grain is the white flour portion of any milled grain, and it's predominantly starch and protein. It is all macro and no micro. It's pretty much devoid of vitamins and minerals. All right, now let's focus on wheat here. So, for pretty much all of history prior to the last 100 years, if you wanted flour, you had to either mill your wheat, mill your grain at home using like a pestle and a mortar, which would take forever, or you had to take it to the millers. So, you would take your whole grain, walk it to the millers, have them mill it with, whatever kind of mill that they used, and then you would take it home and you would use it up and bake with it pretty much right away. Or if you didn't have any grain of your own, then you could buy freshly ground flour from the miller. That's where like the last name Miller comes from. It is from families who owned and operated local mills, and that was an essential part of any community. Villages and communities were built up around mills. This was so essential because wheat, especially, is known as like the staff of life. This was an essential part of people's diets. Now, this age old practice of taking your grain to the miller and having them mill it with their stone mill gave you a true whole wheat or whole grain flour because all they did was mill your grain and give you the flour back that they milled. They did not sift it. Sifting was such an involved, time consuming process that the average person just couldn't afford that. It was only the very wealthy people who could afford sifted flour. And we all know that it's that sifted white flour that we buy at the store. That is what gives you like the light and airy, fluffy cakes and cookies and biscuits and pastries. So it's very desirable. And people have been sifting flour for ages, but like I said, it was just so time consuming that the average person just couldn't make it happen. So, the average person was eating a true whole wheat or whole grain flour, and only the very rich were eating sifted white flour. But that all changed in 1878 with the invention of the steel mill. The steel mill was so efficient that it could sift away nearly all the bran and the germ, leaving just the endosperm white flour portion of the seed, and the rest, the brain and the germ that was sifted away, all of the nutrient dense components basically, was sold as animal feed. The oil found in the bran and germ portion of the grain actually causes flour to spoil not long after it's been milled. That's why in the past, when people would have their grain milled, they would go home and they would use that flour up right away. And anything they didn't use, they would ferment in their sourdough starter and use at a later time. But once that bran and germ is sifted away and all that's left is that white flour endosperm, that actually doesn't go bad. It can be stored very, very long term. So, with the invention and standardization of the steel roller mill in the late 19th to early 20th century, for the first time ever, it was possible to mill massive amounts of white flour and store it long term. So, people just didn't need to mill their own grain anymore. They could go to the store and buy white flour, much like we do today. So, in the early 1900s, with the standardization of pre sifted white flour across the United States, for the first time in history, rich and poor people alike could consume large amounts of sifted white flour. And something pretty crazy started happening. Diseases that had only previously been seen in the rich rose to epidemic proportions in the general population. Diseases like iron deficiency anemia, vitamin B1, and vitamin B3 deficiency were affecting large portions of the population when this had never been the case before. Vitamin B1 deficiency can cause neurological disorders, and vitamin B3 deficiency can cause dermatitis or, just skin problems, dysentery, dementia, and even death. Health officials were eventually able to trace the huge increase in these diseases back to the removal of the germ and bran from wheat when it was milled and sifted. And, the only thing that was being sold to the public was the endosperm white flour portion. The milling companies were told to stop selling sifted flour and to start selling whole grain flour with the bran and germ to the general population, but they were unwilling to do that because remember, I said that they had been profiting from selling the bran and germ for animal feed. So it wasn't until 1941 that the government actually passed a law that mandated enrichment with B vitamins and iron. So at that time, you did see a lot of decrease in these diseases, but then it wasn't until like another, gosh, 40 some years until 1998 that they started fortifying white flour with folic acid. So there were a lot of increased birth defects in the time prior to that. And although this enrichment process cut down on a lot of the more noticeable side effects from eating, pre-milled and sifted wheat, the enrichment process itself is still full of problems. Take the bleaching agent benzoyl peroxide, which is still used today. It destroys B vitamins, vitamin E, and causes respiratory problems. And then you have potassium bromate, which is an oxidizing agent that is used to strengthen the gluten structure in white flour that's sold today. Potassium bromate has been linked to thyroid and liver dysfunction as well as cancer. So these things are still being used today. We are still being sold pre-milled, pre-sifted, fortified, chemically fortified flour when we buy flour at the store. There is no such thing as a true whole wheat or whole grain flour that you can buy at the store because what they do is all grain, when it is milled, is sifted, and then if they want to label it whole grain, they just add back in like a little bit of the germ and bran after the fact, but it's not actually the original intact product. The only way to get intact whole grain is to mill it yourself at home. Now, if you're like me, you're wondering like what are the long-term effects, because this has been going on for about 100 years, that it's been standard that most people, rich and poor, are consuming white flour in westernized countries. Well, there was actually a German study of rats where they broke the rats up into 5 groups. Group 1 consumed freshly ground flour, group 2 was fed bread made from freshly ground flour, and then groups 3 through 5 were fed some sort of, freshly ground flour that had been stored for a few weeks. So it was a few weeks old. It wasn't freshly milled. Or the last group, the 5th group, was fed white flour only. And what they found was that after 4 generations, only the rats from the first 2 groups who were being fed freshly milled or freshly ground flour and bread maintained their fertility. All of the other rats were infertile. And 4 generations of rats is equivalent to 100 years for humans. So we are 100 years in or so, 100 or so years into this experiment of feeding pre-milled white flour to the masses. And what are we seeing? Are we seeing infertility? Yes, we are. It's, increasing at alarming rates. Are we seeing levels of anxiety that are just unprecedented in mental health conditions, skin conditions, digestive conditions? Yes. Now, am I saying that all of this can be traced back to white flour or blamed on white flour? Well, no. I think like a lot of things, it is multifaceted. There are a lot of things in our modern world that are unnatural and that are contributing to the declining health and fertility of our populations, but we cannot overlook these things. And I really do think that because of just the volume that white flour makes up of our daily diet, that is a huge culprit. So one thing that a person could do if they wanted to drastically improve their health and even fertility, start milling your flour at home. It's actually really easy. You don't have to walk it down to the millers and then wait, however long to have them mill it. You can spend a couple $100 on a grain mill and just do it yourself. And it's really quick. So I will link the grain mill that I have in the description. I've had it for maybe 5 or 6 months now. And yeah, like I said, it's really simple. It's not that complicated at all. It doesn't add that much extra time. You actually save money by buying grain in bulk. And the great thing, and then milling your own flour. And another great thing is that you can easily store whole grain long term. They have found grain stored in Egyptian tombs that's like 3,000 years old. And when they go to cultivate it, it's still like brand new. Now, maybe you're wondering, okay, what does all this have to do with feminism? Because I started the video by saying, like, I have this conspiracy theory that, there's a link between feminism and homemade bread. Well, what I'm saying is, you hear a lot about how unhappy homemakers were in the early 20th century. And really, the claim of feminism is that, prior to feminism, women were always oppressed and miserable in the home for all of history. Well, I'm saying that's false. If you go back and look at the information, they actually weren't. Even when it comes to suffrage, did you guys know that 96% of women voted against it? They did not want women's suffrage. So that, that's curious there. That's tells us like, we should probably ask more questions there. I'm well aware that women throughout history have lived through very difficult times and had to deal with a lot and overcome a lot, but we just can't overlook the unprecedented changes that happened in the late 19th to early 20th centuries in how women processed and prepared food and how they gave birth. Things that are like the most important things in a woman's life that affect our health. And I do think that, these things really did cause a lot of women to feel slighted and feel like, okay, something's wrong here. Something's not right. I'm not feeling good. My family's not feeling good. What is wrong? We need a solution. And feminism was there with all kinds of solutions saying, okay, you just need to get out of your house. You just need to stop focusing on the home, stop focusing on having children and caring for your family. And what I'm saying is maybe the diagnosis was right, something was wrong, but I'm saying that the prescription was also wrong. What we need to do is go back and look at these practices of adulterating our food and, basically stealing our birthright of being able to birth babies in a healthy way. All of that was stolen from us. That's what we need to reclaim. We don't need feminism. We need a return to tradition. All right, I'm gonna get off my soapbox. That's it for this week's video. If you liked this video, where I kind of go on a tangent and lead you guys on until the end and then tell you a little conspiracy theory I have, and let me know in the comments. And maybe I'll do some more videos like this. Maybe I can do one where I go into like the history of birth and tell you more about twilight birth and what women have experienced in birth, throughout the ages. But I'm gonna wrap it up for this week. Thank you all for following along. Be sure to check out the offer that Kittle has for Hopewell Heights subscribers in the description below the video. I'll see you next week.